Hello and welcome everyone to our latest edition of our ACP Special Interest Group webinar series for 2026. My distinct honor and pleasure to usher in this latest edition, our Government Special Interest Group. And today's topic is entitled Continuity of Operations, COOP, Modernization in a Distributed Workforce. My name is Dr. Bernard Jones, and I serve on the ACP National Board and in charge of our SIG initiative. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us on these monthly sessions. They've been so wonderful and engaging, and just to be able to share content has been a good thing. So I'll give you a quick overview of our initiative, a brief introduction to today's guest speaker, and then we'll have his presentation and then Q&A at the end. But I just wanted to be mindful to let you know that at any point, if you have a question, you can use the raise hand feature on Zoom, or you can type in your question in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that as well. Myself and my colleague from Group C, Continuity Insights, Mike Giannakis, and he'll come on a little bit later to talk about some great stuff coming up with Continuity Insights. So we'll have a final Q&A at the end if we didn't catch your questions in the interim time. And then I'll talk about coming attractions. We're going to finish out the year with even more great monthly webinar content. So it's been thrilling to provide this to our industry. So really quickly, just to give you a sense, if you've never been on one of these SIG webinars in the past, it's all part of the larger initiative that we created back in 2024. We call it a platform, a community, where we talk specifically about topics around something, whether it's an industry, and it's pretty much they're guided by industry. So we have a SIG for early careerists, those that are new to the field or not making a change. Government, which is what we're going to talk about today. Education is another SIG. Banking and finance. We had a phenomenal SIG session, a webinar last month with healthcare. So all in all, we've talked to our, constituents, our community, and asked the question, what are some of these specific types of special interest groups that you're interested in having content to be provided for? And that's what we've been doing. We've had amazing success with these monthly webinars, and today is just one more example of that. As you can see on the screen, the main thing is to be able to share information, share content, and actually talk about specific topics that are important in this industry around resilience and around what practitioners want to know. So I'll be sharing these slides, and as well as the recording that'll also be shared to everyone, so you'll have a chance to kind of recap and come back to this. Last but not least, I think it's part of the ACP's DNA, sharing knowledge and networking. All right, our team today, like I mentioned myself, Dr. Bernard Jones. Our facilitator and host he's on is Mike Giannakis from Continuity Insights. Again, he'll be on to help facilitate. We're going to work as a team to field questions, and he'll be on at the end to talk about some upcoming really important stuff with Continuity Insights. So the moment has come. Our esteemed and our host and our presenter today is Bob Smith. And again, today's session is part of our Government SIG webinar, Continuity Operations, Modernization in a Distributed Workforce. So today's session will focus on adapting COOP plans for remote or hybrid government operations. And Bob's going to talk about firsthand lessons learned. They'll be shared regarding continuity planning, primarily for a remote hybrid workforce. And let me just talk about Bob's bio here, if I can move this out of the way. Oops. Ooh, I stopped sharing. Sorry. Hit the wrong button. So let's see. Bob is a resiliency. Let's see. Ooh. Sorry, I'm got stuff in the way here. He's been in resilience for over 20 years. Has been an emergency manager in West Virginia, Florida, serving as a consultant to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security during the Obama administration, developing state-level emergency plans for critical infrastructure, and his current position at continuity and as continuity and emergency management program manager for the Colorado Governor's Office of Information Technology. Bob has also worked in the private sector, including designing and leading a global crisis management training and exercise program for a Fortune 500 company and leading emergency preparedness efforts for such high-profile events, including the Super Bowl, the Olympics, the Iditarod, and the World Cup. So I'm going to stop sharing and welcome in Bob Smith as our presenter for today's webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. I appreciate that introduction and the opportunity. Thank you all for taking the time out of your day today to participate in this session. I hope you get some value out of it. As Dr. Jones said, I'm Bob Smith. I am currently a senior consultant with Guidepost Solutions. Before coming to Guidepost, I spent about 25 years in public safety, emergency management, crisis management, and continuity planning in both the private and government sectors. And so today I'm going to be talking about continuity of operations planning when it comes to a distributed workforce. Now, we've seen the concept of distributed workforce, remote, hybrid workforce growing in popularity over the last couple of years. Even now, years after the COVID-19 restrictions have popped up or have gone away, we still see this increased popularity in having a remote workforce. We've seen it for a while in the corporate sector, but we're starting to see it more and more often in government agencies. And so with that comes the need to adapt and modify our continuity planning efforts to address the elements of a distributed workforce. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to cover it in 4 sections. We'll talk about the premise and the baseline, which we're going to talk about some of the continuity planning assumptions that we had back before we started to see this popularity with the distributed workforce concept. Some of those assumptions that we've seen as we've had more and more agencies implement a distributed workforce that have kind of been turned around, turned upside down in some cases. And we really need to take a moment to address those changes and incorporate those elements into our continuity planning. I'm going to talk a little bit about some lessons learned as we have seen more and more government agencies start to implement a distributed workforce model. We've got agencies that are doing it. We've seen some of the lessons learned from those processes and some of those things that we can incorporate into our own planning. I'm going to talk about preparing and educating the workforce. We'll talk about what it means to provide training for continuity, emergency planning for a workforce that is distributed, but also what types of changes do you need to make to your training programs to incorporate those elements of a distributed workforce. And then I'm going to wrap up with some suggestions, ideas, tips, some things that you may potentially be able to take back to your agencies and implement in the next 90 days or so that may add some value to your own continuity planning efforts. So we'll jump right into it. The assumption that quietly broke. So if you look at some of the continuity planning assumptions that were intrinsic to our planning efforts previously, you start to see some things pop out that need to be modified. Our continuity plans, for a very large part, revolved around the concept of a catastrophic loss of a facility, a site, our office, our headquarters, and how we would continue to operate after that loss, how we would continue to carry out our essential functions. Our plans included an alternate facility where we would relocate and continue our operations. It included information on how long it would take to get people moved over to this new location and get them set up and operating, what it would look like once they're operating in this new facility. It usually included some formal declaration, right? It usually said, at this point, somebody will stand up and say, this is it. We're activating our continuity plan. We are relocating to our alternate facility, um, and off we go. But then in March of 2020, we saw a lot of that kind of get turned upside down, right? We saw that we didn't necessarily need an alternate facility to transition our work from inside to outside. We basically had people work from home. We didn't have a formal declaration. This is it. We're activating our plan. We basically said, everybody go home and we'll figure this out. And when we sent people home, we really didn't have any idea how long it would be before they came back into the office or if they were going to come back into the office, right? So we kind of, a lot of the things that were core components of how we planned for a continuity event uh, really kind of got mixed up and jumbled. And those are the kinds of things that we need to address because at the end of the day, things like that saw us not necessarily activate an alternate facility, we activated an alternate workforce. So what did it look like back then versus how it looks now? Since we've started to see people transition to a distributed workforce. So back then, our continuity plan included an alternate site. It included usually a facility that was at least 50 miles away from our primary facility so that anything that impacted our primary facility was less likely to impact our secondary facility. But now we've seen that we can shift people not from inside our buildings out to wherever they work from, wherever they live. Back in the day, we had a formalized activation uh, order, if you will, that would be called out. Again, this is it. We're relocating. We had a very specific time frame built in for how long it would take us to accomplish this relocation. And once somebody made the call, our plan said we would transition to the new facility. And what we found with code was a good example. We were already doing it, and nobody ever formally made that, this is it, we're implementing our plan call. Our plans revolved around the concept of a co-located staff, right? The idea was our employees would basically still work together. The teams, the departments, the groups would still work together like they did inside our buildings, just in another building, right? And it doesn't work quite that way, we're seeing, obviously. We're seeing a distributed workforce, which means we've got people that are working remotely. We've got some people that are working from the office. We've got some that are working a mixture of the two. We've got, depending on how widespread your workforce is, you may have people working in different time zones. You've probably got people working day shifts, evening shifts, night shifts. So we've got people working from multiple locations at different times of the day. So they're not co-located working side by side like they were before. Our continuity plan used to say that we could activate and we could operate from outside our primary facility for days, weeks, maybe months. But we've seen that we can operate outside of a government facility now for months or years or even indefinitely. The communications and operations in our planning used to be focused on the internet and the phone service in our alternate location. So the idea was our employees would pick up their laptops, relocate to our alternate facility, plug in, and go right back to work using that internet and those phones. But we're not seeing that, right? We're seeing employees use home internet connections and in some cases, personal devices to do our work. And then we knew that our continuity planning efforts would fail back then if our alternate facility was unavailable for whatever reason. But now we know our continuity planning efforts can fail for a variety of reasons that don't even involve an alternate facility. It can fail for a loss of connectivity or power for our employees who are working remotely. It can fail because we don't have the right access, the right credentials, the right authorizations for those employees to access internal systems and internal networks. And we've seen that even something as basic as childcare for our employees can actually impact our agency's ability to carry out our essential functions. So a lot has changed as we've started to see this increased popularity for a distributed workforce. And so what does it look like today? Well, even now, years after the restrictions from COVID have been released, we still see the debate raging. The remote work versus in the office debate. We see it every day in the media. It seems like there's at least one article, one editorial that talks about remote work is better, working from the office is better. We see it even today on a regular basis. These are some of the headlines just from the last year or so, including just last month, that discuss the debate between working from the office and working from home. And we see the numbers, right? Right now, about 12 states have no statewide telework policy for state government. They leave the decision up to the agency head or the supervisors. 13 states have a hybrid policy that requires a certain number of days in the office. 9 of those actually require the majority of days in the office. In 2023, 13.8%, the numbers of US workers that were working from home, which was more than double what it was in 2019. And it changes regularly, right? Texas, it was 3 months from the time Texas banned uh, remote work as an option for state government employees until they reinstated it as an option. So it changes. And that's the thing that we need to be prepared to address with our continuity planning, because our plans can't be static anymore, because our workforce is not a concrete policy that's set in stone and never going to change. It's going to change. It may not have changed for a while, but it could potentially change tomorrow, next week, or next year. And a good example of that's here in Colorado, where I'm located. Here in Colorado, the governor has decided that the decision on whether or not state government employees can work from home is left up to the individual agency heads, the executive directors of the state agencies. So you've got about 30 state government agencies here in Colorado. Some of them work almost entirely from home. Some of them work almost entirely from the office. And some of them work a hybrid of the two. And that's been in place for quite a while now. It's pretty formalized. It's been in place for several years, but we're about to have a gubernatorial election here in Colorado, which means a new governor, potentially new agency heads for our state government agencies. And so even though that policy is firmly established now here in Colorado, it stands to change in the next 12 to 18 months. And so our planning needs to be reflective of that flexibility in our workforces. And the debate still rages, and it doesn't really matter which side of the argument you're on, whether you're on the side that says remote work is better because it provides better employee morale, better productivity, it saves us money on facilities, it helps us with recruiting, or if the side that says working from the office promotes more team building, collaboration, accountability. Regardless of which side of the argument you're on, there's a couple of things that we can all agree on. One, there's no one size fits all when it comes to planning. What works for one agency won't necessarily work for another. And two, it's going to change. And so we have to be prepared for those changes to happen in our workforce in order for our continuity planning efforts to be effective. We have to start looking at making those changes. Now, the upside is we don't have to throw our plan out and start from scratch, right? Because a lot of the elements of continuity planning are still there. Only the context has changed. You still have essential functions, essential records. You've still got lines of succession, delegations of authority. Those things are still in there. They're still part of our plan. We've got 2 federal directives that drive it from a federal perspective. In 2024, FEMA updated the continuity guidance circular. All of those elements are still in there. They still have to be incorporated. They still have to be part of your plan. Now, we just need to look at them from the perspective of those elements may need to be performed by somebody who may never set foot in a government facility during an emergency situation. So let's take a look at some of the things that we have seen occur as we see this increase in popularity of a distributed workforce. We've seen agencies send people out to work remote already, and we're starting to get some lessons learned from those agencies who are sending people out to work remotely. Lesson number one, essential functions were mapped to buildings, not to people. So we've seen this a lot. A lot of our continuity planning efforts, again, were focused on where the work was being done and where the work would be done if we had to abandon that primary location. It focused on the physical locations. There was less emphasis on the people, who was doing the work, how they were doing the work, and what tools or processes they needed to do that work, right? We were focusing more on the location. We also saw a lot of agencies call out essential functions in their continuity plans that rested on one person or one team. And if for some reason that one person or one team was unavailable, then that essential function started to fall apart. We saw the opposite as well. We saw agencies that were not calling out things that were essential functions because, at least initially on paper, they didn't look like they were critical to our core agency's mission, right? Things like IT service desk, payroll, badging, purchase card approvals, things that, in fact, if they start to fall apart, it impacts our ability to carry out our essential functions, right? Uh, for example, if you are a government IT agency, your essential functions are probably going to look something like we're going to support, maintain, and secure our infrastructure and our networks. We're going to support the agencies, partners, and stakeholders who use our network and our infrastructure, right? Pretty straightforward. It's going to be focusing on that service delivery. What it's not going to incorporate is the fact that you still have to make sure your people are safe, that they're accounted for, that they're getting paid, that your bills are getting paid. And when those kinds of things start to break down, it impacts your mission essential functions. And so we were seeing a lot of people not drilling down to the level of detail needed when it came to developing your essential functions. So what can we do? We can start by looking at our essential functions. We look at them from a task and dependency perspective, right? We want to look at less at where the work's being done and more at who's doing the work, how they're doing the work, and what tools and processes they need in order to accomplish that work, regardless of where they're located. And we need to stop focusing less on the physical location and more on the people. Another lesson that we've learned is reachability is not accountability. So we've all seen it. Supervisors look at Microsoft Teams or Google Chat and they see a little green circle and it tells them that employee is online diligently working away. But it doesn't, right? It doesn't really tell us that at all. All it really tells us is that somewhere on the other side of the abyss, that is the interwebs, a device is turned on and is somehow connected to the internet in some form. It doesn't tell us if that employee is safe, if they're accounted for, doesn't tell us if they need help after an emergency situation, doesn't tell us if they can continue to do the work that we need them to do. It just tells us that a device somewhere is online. We also, when it came to accountability, started seeing that employee contact information was outdated. Probably not surprising to a lot of folks. Most agencies do a great job of gathering contact information, employee information when somebody's hired, names, contact numbers, addresses, emergency contacts. We do less of a great job in maintaining that information long term. So what happens is as agencies start to send employees out into the world to work somewhere besides in their primary facility, the ability to communicate directly with that employee, especially during an emergency situation, became a little more challenging, right? Because the contact information was outdated. So what can we do when it comes to accountability for a distributed workforce? First of all, take a look at your employee contact information. Make sure it's up to date. Make sure you have a formalized process for updating that information long term, whether it's someone in HR, whether it's an internal process, whether you're relying on the employees to log in and update it regularly. Whatever that process is, make sure you have a formalized process and you're following. One organization I worked with every year in September, as part of Emergency Preparedness Month, they would conduct weekly employee notification tests that required a response. And the employees who responded were entered into a drawing to win a prize. And so at least once a year, the employees were updating their contact information because they could win a prize. Whatever the process looks like, make sure you have one and you're following it. We also want to start to look at an accountability window. How long do you want a supervisor or a people manager to attempt to contact a remote working employee in an emergency situation before you say it's time to shift that work over? How long before you stop um, counting on that employee to get the work done and shift the work? And we're looking at about a 4-hour window right now. Now, that might be a lot sooner depending on the criticality of the work that employee is doing. But at minimum, at about the 4-hour mark, you want to start looking at shifting that person's workload over to somebody else if need be, if you haven't heard from that employee. Now, you obviously still want to try and contact an employee. You want to find out if they're safe, if they're accounted for. You want to find out if they need help. And then you want to find out if they continue to do the work that you need them to do. But until you get that confirmation, you need to start looking at plan B to shift that work over. And during an emergency situation, we want to name one person or one group to be responsible for accountability, right? We want one person or group reaching out to determine who's available, who's safe, who needs help, and who can continue to operate. And we want it to be just one person or one group because we don't want 15 different people reaching out to our employees during an emergency to ask them about their status, right? So some things you can do for accountability when it comes to a distributed workforce. Another lesson that we've learned is the notification tree had a single point of failure, our intranet, right? So our continuity plans, our crisis management plans, our incident management plans had a plethora of alert processes, notification processes, conference lines, bridge numbers to bring people together and notify people and provide situational awareness during an emergency incident. And we had practiced that over the years, right? We sent employee notifications. We brought people together on bridges to discuss issues as part of exercises, as part of real world events. But we'd always done that from inside the perimeter, right? Meaning we'd always sent out employee notifications from inside our facilities using our internal networks during regular business hours. We didn't have someone sending out an employee notification sitting at their kitchen table. We weren't doing exercises of these processes after hours, on weekends, on holidays. And so what we found is as people shift out to work remote instead of working inside a facility, some of those processes relied a little too heavily on your internal networks and your internal infrastructure. And they start to break down. We started to see managers using personal devices and personal text to communicate with employees during an emergency situation, which is fine if that's something that your agency allows. But what it doesn't do when it comes to accountability is it doesn't provide information on who did that manager reach out to, who did they contact, who didn't they get contact with. It doesn't record that kind of information. You're relying on that manager to manually record that level of accountability so it can be pushed up through your chain. And obviously that's not the most efficient or effective way to operate when it comes to accountability. So what are a few things that we can do to address accountability and notification out to our employees during an emergency situation if they are a distributed workforce? First of all, you want to look at your process for sending out emergency or employee notifications. Whatever your primary system is or tool is, look at a secondary system. Preferably a secondary system that works independent of your internal networks. Even if it's something as simple as having your supervisors record their direct reports and their supervisors' phone numbers in their phone so that they can make calls, gather information on everybody's status, and push it up through the chain. Even if it's something that simple, have a secondary process that is not dependent on your internal systems. You also want to start looking at conducting no notice employee notification tests, right? Send those notices out, the notifications out to your employees. require a response or an acknowledgement, track who doesn't respond or acknowledge the message, and find out why. Was it an issue with the contact information being outdated or wrong? Was it an issue with the platform or the tool that you use to communicate with your employees? Was it just because the employee didn't understand the process? Whatever the issue was, track down those that don't respond to your messages when you conduct those tests, find out why, and address the issue before an emergency occurs. Another lesson we learned is that devolution has to stop being considered the end of the world, right? We have always had devolution processes built into our plans. It's a requirement. It's usually at least an element. Sometimes it's its own annex. But every year, somebody would grab the continuity plan, take a look at it, run through the boxes and check them off. This is here, this is here, this is here, this needs updated. Yes, we have a devolution process in our plan. At some point, we should probably take a minute to look and see if it actually works the way we think it will. But for today, check the box. It's in there. We're good for another year. And that's how we were handling devolution in a lot of cases. We weren't looking to see, are we handing off information to or our work to someone that's already impacted as well, that can't carry out the work of their own, let alone ours too. And so we tended to just do the bare minimums when it came to our devolution process because it's a scary concept, right? It's a concept, it's considering what it means if your agency has been so drastically impacted, you can no longer accomplish your core mission. And you have to hand that work off, those essential functions, to somebody else. And it becomes a little more challenging, right, for a government organization. You know, if it's a corporate entity, depending on how they're designed, it may be a little bit more straightforward. If your Miami office is being impacted by a hurricane, you can lift and shift that work to the Kansas City office. A little more straightforward, depending on the organization, how they're designed. A little more challenging for a government agency, right? What if you are the state treasury department? Who do you hand that work off to? Another state agency? Another agency in another state? You hand it off to your local counter or county counterparts? Whatever that process is, it has to be spelled out. And you have to have those defined triggers that say this is when we do it, because that was another area that's historically been lacking in our devolution process. It was usually some general statement that said, when we can no longer accomplish our mission essential functions, we are going to implement our devolution process. We've got very defined triggers built everywhere else in our plan that tell us when this happens, we do this. We don't have that same level of detail very often when it comes to our devolution process. And so we need to start looking at those and define the very specific triggers. We have to send out 100 reports every day. Today, we can only send out one. So we implement our devolution process. We have to drill down to that level of specificity when it comes to our essential functions and determine at what point, what is that exact point that our devolution process kicks in. And the thing about working with a distributed workforce is you're already doing some of that, right? And that's one of the things that you can look at to adapt to a distributed workforce. You're already shifting work and responsibilities from inside your building, inside your network, to a remote location, to somebody working from home. You're already shifting that out. So now it's just a matter of starting to view devolution as more of a load shedding process. And again, not focusing on the location as much as keeping the work going, and stop looking at the devolution annex as something we hope we never open, because we're already doing it to an extent with a distributed workforce. We just need to flesh it out a bit more to address all of our essential functions. Another lesson we've learned is that essential records were reachable until they weren't. So a lot of our continuity planning efforts revolved around the concept that our documents, our records, our plans, policies, procedure, they were all located in the cloud. Never mind the fact that the cloud just means somebody else's server, right? It's in the cloud, so we're good. What we have started to see as agencies push their employees out into the world to start working remotely is it's less about where and how your records and your documentation is stored and how accessible those records and that documentation is. Because if someone cannot access those records, that documentation just as easily from a remote location as they would from inside your building or on your internal networks, then it doesn't matter how great they are, they're useless, right? And we still have in some government agencies a lot of hard copy processes, original signatures, notarized documents that we maintain for operations that are locked up behind a door somewhere in a building. Again, totally inaccessible to an employee who's working remotely. And so, again, if those aren't accessible just as easily from home as they are from inside your building, they're useless. And so you need to start looking at that access. Do your employees have VPN access? Do they have adequate connectivity? Do they have the right authorizations, credentials to access those documents just as easily from their kitchen table as they would from a desk in your building? Once you start doing that, you'll start to address your essential records and your documentation and the accessibility of those documents, not just that you have them stored and they're secure. And then finally, one very important lesson that we have learned through this process is that succession has to work at 11 p.m. from a kitchen table. All right. So let's be completely candid with each other. When it comes to our continuity planning efforts, our lines of succession, our delegations of authority, were usually the easiest portion of our plan to draft and the simplest portion of our plan to update every year, right? Because all we usually did was reach out to HR, grab a copy of the organizational chart, and plop it into our plan, right? Easy enough. What we traditionally did not do was take that one step further. So we did a good job of dropping that organizational chart into the plan. So we knew if Mary was out of pocket, Kevin stepped into her role. We traditionally didn't look at that secondary impact or downstream impact. So what if Mary's out of pocket, Kevin's supposed to step into her role? Who's supposed to take over Kevin's work? Or is he now required to do both jobs during a crisis situation? Or Mary's out of pocket, Kevin's supposed to step into her role, but Kevin's also out of pocket. He's impacted by the incident. He's on vacation in the Bahamas. Whatever the reason, he can't step into Mary's role now. He's unavailable. So now what do? We have nobody in either role, actually. And we incorporated our delegations of authority on paper in our plans, but we really didn't drill down to the level of detail that we needed to, right? Because that delegation of authority is another area in the government that's a little bit trickier than it is in a corporate setting, right? Because if you look at state, local, federal government leadership positions, a lot of them are assigned responsibilities and tasks by things like constitutions, legislative requirements, regulatory statutes, things that make it a little more challenging than just saying, tag, you're it, to have somebody step into that role, right? Some of them even require a formal swearing in process to give someone the formal authority to step into that role and do that job. And we exercised having somebody step into that role before, right? We'd started an exercise by saying, Kevin, Mary's out, you're handling this role for this exercise. We'd done that. A few things we hadn't looked at though was what happens if Kevin has to step into that role at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday? What if he has to step into that role at 8 a.m. on Christmas Day? We weren't looking at that level of detail. We weren't looking at those delegations of authority. What processes have to take place to empower that person with the authority to do the job? What documentation needed to be drafted? What notifications needed to be sent out? Who needed to be consulted? We weren't testing and exercising that component. And so what can we do to make some changes there? So we can look at naming your successors at least 3 deep. Have a plan A, B, and C for each position, especially if it's a position that's critical to your response to a continuity incident. Also, take a look at your delegation of authority process. What does it take to give somebody the authority to step in that role? How much of that can you do in advance? Can you draft the process paperwork that needs to be drafted in advance? Can you can notification messages to make the notifications? How much of that delegation of authority can you craft in advance so that when it comes time, it's a click of the button? And then start to build that kind of thing into your exercises. Build in what happens if Kevin has to step into Mary's position at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. Build in what it takes to give Kevin the authority to do that job if he has to step into it. Build that level of detail into your exercises to help deal with that concept of not having everybody centrally located in a specific facility. So we're going to talk a little bit about education, but before we do, have there been any questions? Are there any questions so far?
Yeah, I didn't want to jump in, Bob, earlier. You had such a great flow there, but hats off to Franklin Bell. Couple of items in the Q&A. Thank you. I'll read them and you can address them, Bob, or if others want to chime in. First thing from Franklin is, has the panel considered developments in emergency warnings, for example, with the Federal Communications Commission, Common Alert Protocol, and ITU UN standard, UN disaster risk reduction, improvements technology, for example, in cell phones, broadcast and other delivery, and then provides information on a link for, I think there's an emergency notification system. So kind of general. I think you talked about that, but do you want to chime in on that one?
Sure. And I think so. All of those standards are very applicable in this concept. All of those tools are certainly applicable. One of the things, and maybe it's a trick of the trade for those of us who work in entities where there is a level of continuity preparedness required in what we do every day, especially if you work in a government agency, it doesn't. Because somewhere within your organization on the government side, somebody's already sending emergency alerts out, right? Somebody's already notifying the public when there's a disaster. Somebody's already notifying the media when there's an incident that requires it. Those processes are in place. Those tools are in place. Most of them meet those standards, use those tools that Franklin mentioned. So this is an area where we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We want to take those tools, those processes, those platforms, and use them to communicate internally with our own employees using the same tools and processes, right? It's one of those areas where all of those things are great and add a great amount of value to continuity planning. We need to make sure we're providing that same level of service to our own employees when an emergency situation happens.
Great. Excellent. Follow up from Franklin. Do you work with state emergency communications committees? And do you want to, if that, maybe you want to get that define more if you don't don't know what that is? I'm not sure what it is, but
Sure. So any clarification would be great.
yeah,
I have done a lot of work with state emergency communications groups and state communications associations and things like that over the years in drafting communications processes, again, to be used to notify and educate the greater public, and then having the agencies tailor that for their own employees, certainly. Yeah.
great. Um, Franklin also adds, a devolution example is Cantor Fitzgerald, bonds traders who lost 99% of their staff in Manhattan on 9/11. Next day, they were back in business with their data backup through their London office. So just a kind of a point there.
Great example.
Next, Clarence Elliott. Can we get the slides? Absolutely. The slides, as well as the recording of this, will be made available to everyone. And let me just check the chat real quick there, Bob. Let's see if
Sure.
anything is in there. Thank you, Andrew. Tieson. Love the initial slide you had there, Bob. On the topic of still needing facilities, one thing we encountered was still needing to know how, where, who could receive critical mail, such as legal correspondence and notices. You want to touch on that one?
That is a very good point, and it's one of those things where when we think about accessing documents and plans and processes and records, nowadays we almost immediately focus on digital media and Word documents and Google documents and those hard copy documents that I mentioned earlier, which includes mail and important critical mail and deliveries and things like that. If it's just being dropped off at the door for your facility, but everybody's working from home, um, it doesn't really matter how critical it was before it got there. It's useless now, right? And the same for any other documents that you rely on that are hard copy for whatever reason. If they are locked up in a government facility somewhere and your entire workforce is working remotely, doesn't matter how critical they are to your operations, they are inaccessible, therefore they are useless. So you have to have a process to access that documentation, mail, hard copies, things like that, to make sure it's not just sitting somewhere gathering dust and not doing what it's supposed to.
Great. Just two more, then I'll let you continue.
Sure.
Mark Carroll, my good friend, he writes, the 50-mile relocation distance is highly dependent on defense in depth. Previous trading function failed over to buildings next door in capitals, letters. Seems crazy, except that there were 2 to 3 layers of failover in case the entire campus was impacted.
That is a great example, and I can give a personal example. I was as a county emergency manager in a previous position. My EOC was supposed to be fully redundant when it came to our fiber optics running into the facility. So we had cable coming in from 2 different locations, from 2 different vendors, so that if one failed, theoretically, we had a secondary, a backup. What we found during a very critical activation at one point was that the last 5 feet of both fiber optic cables came into the EOC through the same conduit. So when that one conduit was severed by a construction, we lost all of our connectivity, even though we were at the time one of the most redundant EOCs in the state. So that is an excellent example that sometimes the distance is a critical factor in your continuity planning. Good point.
Great, excellent. And last one, someone writes, can you repeat the business case again of the New York operation who assumed practice in London on 9/11? Didn't catch the name. Sorry if I went too quick. It was Cantor Fitzgerald. So again, you can look them up, and what happened there. All right, great. Go for it, Bob. You can keep on going there.
All right, great. So we're going to talk a little bit about educating your workforce when it comes to incorporating the elements of a distributed workforce into your continuity planning. And fortunately, this is another area of continuity planning that doesn't mean that your plan needs to be thrown out the window and rebuilt from scratch, because you're already doing a lot of it. You're already educating your employees on what happens when an emergency incident occurs. You're educating them on your continuity planning efforts, roles, responsibilities. You're probably even doing some level of annual refresher training for your employees. What you're going to start looking at now is incorporating the elements of distributed workforce into that training and that education. And you start with the basics. So one of the things you want to look at is connectivity, the connectivity of your employees who are working remote. And I'll give you one piece of advice today. And if you learn nothing else from this presentation, take this one piece of advice. If you have employees who work remote, even occasionally for your organization, take the time to establish a baseline minimum bandwidth for people who are working remote. Whatever that bottom line, lowest level of connectivity is that's required for your organization, make sure your employees know that they have to have at least that level of connectivity, that they know how to test their own connectivity so they know they're meeting that minimum requirement. From there, start looking at redundancy. And it will vary based on the criticality of the work the employee does for you. But look at things like, do they have a hotspot they can operate from? Can they relocate to a coffee shop, to a library to get connectivity if their internet is out at home? Look at their power situation from the same perspective. Do they have backup power? How long can they operate without power? Can they relocate to a coffee shop, to a library, to a family member's home to operate without power? And if they get to the point where they have to start handing off their work, what's that process look like? What are the priorities? What do they have to hand off first? What can they hand off last? What can they just keep and not hand off at all because it can wait till they get back online? Then look at their own emergency planning. You need to be encouraging your employees to have, especially if they're working primarily remotely, their own level of emergency preparedness. Plans for them, their family, their households. We saw the alternative years ago with Hurricane Katrina when people walked away from work to go and make sure their families were safe. It's understandable. It's human nature. So make sure your employees are doing their own emergency planning, continuity planning for their families and their households, and incorporate that concept into your organization's education and training. Teach your employees what they need when it comes to building emergency plans, assembling emergency kits, knowing what their evacuation routes are. Um, Help them understand what level of preparedness they need for themselves and their families will add a lot of value to your agency's continuity planning. And look at hard copy documents, phone numbers, plans, policies, procedures, records. If your agency allows people who work remote to have hard copies of documentation, encourage them to have that documentation printed out, hard copies available and accessible. So if they can't get to it digitally, they can still do the work that you need them to do. And then after you've developed that process, train the way you operate. Again, it's something you're probably already doing. It's not something where you're going to need to reinvent the wheel. When you're doing your orientation, touch on those things like connectivity, backup power, emergency planning when you're educating new hires. For your discussion-based exercises, incorporate elements of distributed workforce when you're having those conversations. And it doesn't have to be a formal process. It can be your weekly team meeting starts out with the question, if this happened today, how would we respond? Spend the next 60 minutes having that conversation with your team. For your functional drills, full scale exercises, or again, things that you're already doing, you just want to start to incorporate the elements of a distributed workforce. So look at things like those no notice employee notifications and tracking the responses. Have employees who work primarily remotely occasionally work from somewhere else besides home. And have them work from a coffee shop, have them work from a library. Back in the day, we used to say if our employees couldn't work from our office, we would send them home to work. Look at that from the other way around. If they can't work from home, can they come into the office and work? What does that process look like? Have you had them come in occasionally to test? Do they have the peripherals, the cables to plug into the system? Do they know which Wi-Fi still to connect to when they come into the building? Do their employee badges still open the doors to let them in the building? So build those types of things into your processes as well. Have them test that ability to work from somewhere besides home. And for full scales, again, you're already doing it. Just build elements into your scenarios that reflect a distributed workforce. Look at things like our VPN's out of service, or our intranet's out of service, or that one or two critical members of our leadership team are out of pocket. Build those elements into the scenarios for the exercises you're already doing, and you'll already have that knocked out. So some things that you can hopefully take away from today that you can implement over the course of the next 90 days or so that may add some value to your own continuity planning efforts. Number one, look at your employee contact information. I can't hit on that enough. We all do a great job of getting that initially when somebody first comes on board. It's the long-term maintenance where people tend to fall short. So make sure you have a formal process for updating that contact information and follow that process. Whatever it looks like, make sure you have it and you're following it. Take a look at your essential functions. Start to drill down into your essential functions to look at those components that at least initially didn't look critical on paper, like getting your bills paid, paying your employees, checking on your employees' safety and accountability. Those things that start to impact your core agency mission if they start to break down, and then add those into your essential functions. And then test it cold. And by that, I mean run your tests off your internal system. So run an employee notification that doesn't rely on your internal processes or your internal networks. Conduct an exercise that starts out by saying our VPN or intranet is offline. Try to run things off the grid. Try to exercise things completely off your internal processes. And that will get you a long way towards establishing some updated continuity when it comes to a distributed workforce. And some other things that you can look at and take away from today. Remember, look at continuity as traveling with the employee now. Focus less on where the work is being done, the location, and more on who's doing it, how they're doing it, and what the tools and processes are for getting the work done. Remember that reachability is not readiness. Knowing that somebody's little green circle is green and that they're online doesn't tell you that that employee is safe, they're accounted for, doesn't tell you if they need help after an emergency, doesn't tell you if they can continue to do the work that you need them to do. And when it comes to updating your continuity plans, conducting your exercises, start with the assumption that your internal systems are offline. If you start with that assumption from the very beginning, it will really take your planning efforts and your exercises to that next level, which will help you address how to keep a distributed workforce up and running because your internal systems are down and they still need to get the work done. And then educate continuously, right? Remember, training is a habit. It's not a document. It's not a program. It's a habit. And the one thing that I always say is your plans are only as strong as the least educated person on your team when it comes to emergency planning. So, and with that, I will open it up to any questions.
Fantastic, Bob. I have one question that came up in the Q&A. I'll go to that now, and then we can open it up. Thank you again, Mark. Carol, as one of the 5 major private sector contact people in GAO-04-384, yes, it was a long time ago. One of the key challenges was identifying critical functions and conversely getting agreement on the non-critical. Is this still a challenge? Are there guidelines that push a function either way?
It is absolutely still a challenge that we see quite frequently when it comes to determining your essential functions. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it's a lot of work to identify your essential functions, right? It's a lot of work to say, this is what our agency does. So the narrower the list, the easier that process. Secondly, you've got some turf protections, stakeholder protections, siloing going on, obviously. My process is just as important as your process, so why is it not included in this? So making sure it's as all-encompassing as possible is a challenge. But again, as I pointed out, more often than not, we run into losing the things, excuse me, that are essential that we didn't really think about. If your employees, if your bills aren't getting paid, if your IT service desk is offline, it doesn't matter what your agency's primary mission is, those things are not getting done. So establishing those functions, but then drilling down to that level to look at dependencies is probably the next step in the process.
Excellent. And Mark ends with saying, loudest voice syndrome. All good.
Okay.
From Alicia Henderson, how do you influence folks through testing that feel that testing remote staff is equally as important as testing associates that work in a physical building?
That's a good point. And one of the ways that you can address that, and I gave the example earlier of the organization that I worked with where they used a process that involved prizes. But we also, in one agency that I worked with, we established some leadership competition, obviously. We had the different department directors. We created a dashboard where we recorded whose employees were responding like they were supposed to and put it on a dashboard. And so we could point to a department director and say, hey, your team's doing great. You're in the 90 percentile of getting these, which means your employees have their contact information up to date. You, on the other hand, Director B, only 4 people out of your 400 replied. And so there's some areas we need to work at. But I think that's a big part of it is uh, remember that broadcasting is not the same as communicating. So if you're just sending that information out into the network and you're not finding that getting acknowledged or responded to, it's essentially useless. So encouraging people to respond, reminding people why it's important to keep that information up to date so that they can be notified during an emergency is critical, I think.
Excellent. So just being mindful of time, we only have 1 more minute. I want to turn it over to the facilitator and colleague, Mike Giannakis from Group C and Continuity Insights. And then I'll end up giving a good thank you to Bob for what he did today. But go ahead, Mike.
Yes, thank you, Bob. That was a great presentation. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Bernie, again. Just very quickly, I know we're running late, but I wanted to encourage everybody listening to visit continuityinsights.com/CIMC, and that's where you could learn all about the CIMC event in 2027. That's going to be held in Chicago, May 3rd through 5th, and there you can get information about registering to attend the conference, but you could also still present a proposal if you would like to speak at the conference. And we are holding our call for presentations. We extended the deadline until September 1st. So we encourage everybody to go check that out, submit a presentation if you are interested in speaking there. It's continuityinsights.com/CIMC. Thank you all again. And thank you, Bernie. Yeah, appreciate it.
Great. Got two more items that came in. We can get these answered afterwards. How do you introduce these continuity concepts to students in higher education, those new to the workforce, from David Knock? And then, do you suggest that the institution gathers for continuity of the household as well? Can this be part of the welfare package? So we'll make sure we get those answered and sent out. But I wanted to end by saying, awesome, fantastic job, Bob. Thank you so much for, number one, stepping in to lead this presentation, but number two, more important, amazing content, and just learned so much today. So thank you for just being a part of this SIG webinar series and for your contribution today. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it, and it was a lot of fun.
All right. Again, all these content and recordings will be made available. Thank you all for joining us, and you'll see some advertisements and marketing for the next couple of SIGs. We got a great one coming up in September that's going to be led by Michelle Turner. So thank you, and take care.